Hello and welcome to today's video. It is on what is a sprint retrospective. The objectives for this video are to define what a sprint retrospective is, describe the difference between a sprint review and a sprint retrospective, why run a sprint retrospective, discuss the length of the sprint retrospective meeting, the sprint retrospective questions to be asked in the meeting, corrective actions, 5 action steps for conducting a successful sprint retrospective meeting, and things that you can run into in a sprint retrospective and how to handle them as a project manager. So let's get started. So by definition, a retrospective allows you to look back on past events or situations. Thus, a sprint retrospective is a meeting that occurs after the sprint review and prior to the next sprint planning. And that could be thought of as a lessons learned meeting. It is not to be confused with a sprint review, which creates an opportunity for the team to showcase the work that has just been completed in the latest sprint, such as a demo. Once the sprint review is over, the sprint retrospective typically takes place. So the retrospective session is basically an improvement meeting held to find ways and means to identify potential pitfalls, past mistakes, and seek out new ways to avoid those mistakes, which are attended by all, the product owner, the scrum master, and the development team members, and optionally the stakeholders. The sprint retrospective should create a safe space for people to share their honest feedback on what's going well, what can be improved, and generate a discussion around things that should change the next time around with actionable items documented. Retrospectives can be used for any type of team working on a shared project, but the sprint retrospective is especially optimized for an agile production team. It is one of the ceremonies that the Scrum and Kanban teams leverage throughout cyclical product development. In other words, a sprint retrospective meeting is to find out what activities and things the team is doing well, what activities should be continued, and what more can be done to improve the next sprint to be more enjoyable or productive. They inspect and adapt principles, play a key role in the retrospective session for making the next sprint more enjoyable and productive. So there is a difference between a sprint review and a sprint retrospective, and as you can see on this slide, the sprint review is about demoing the work that was just completed, and the sprint retrospective is about identifying areas of improvement to make the next sprint better. That's the general overview of the difference between a sprint review and a sprint retrospective. So why run a sprint retrospective? Well, it creates a safe, blameless space for team members to share their valuable feedback. It allows the team to document wins and areas of opportunity. It provides an actionable list of next steps and identifies who's owning which item. It identifies small, incremental changes that could lead to larger waves of improvement. It allows teams to iterate on their process to amplify results. It allows opinions to be heard. It helps the team mature, and it makes each sprint better than the last. So let's talk about the length of a sprint retrospective meeting. The thumb rule for the length of a sprint retrospective meeting is that it usually takes no more than 45 minutes per week of a sprint duration. So as you can see on this slide, the table illustrates this rule. For 1 week, if it was a 1 week sprint duration, then you would do a 45-minute sprint retrospective. If it's a 2 week, you do 90 minutes, 3 weeks, 130 or 2.5 hours, 4 weeks, 3 hours. You should never exceed like 4 hours with this. And note that the exact length of the sprint retrospective is influenced by the factors such as how many people are on the team, how new the team is, and whether any team members are located remotely. Because the purpose of the sprint retrospective is to plan ways to increase quality and effectiveness. The Scrum team inspects how the last sprint went with regards to individuals, interactions, processes, tools, and their definition of done. Inspected elements often vary with the domain of work, and assumptions that led them astray are identified and their origins are explored. The Scrum team discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems it encountered, and how these problems were or were not solved. So the Scrum team identifies the most helpful changes to improve its effectiveness, and the most impactful improvements are addressed as soon as possible. They may even be added to the sprint backlog for the next sprint. The Sprint Master encourages the rest of the Scrum team to improve its processes and practices to make it more effective and enjoyable for the next sprint. So during each sprint retrospective, the Scrum team plans ways to increase product quality by improving work processes or adapting the definition of done, if appropriate, or not in conflict with product or organizational standards. So by the end of the sprint retrospective, the Scrum team should have identified improvements that it will implement in the next sprint, and implementing these improvements in the next sprint is the adaptation to the inspection of the Scrum team itself. So although improvements may be implemented at any time, the sprint retrospective provides a formal opportunity to focus on inspection and adaptation. The sprint retrospective concludes the sprint. It is time boxed in a maximum of 3 or 4 hours for 1 month sprint, and for shorter sprints, the event is usually a lot shorter. So there's some different questions that come out of the sprint retrospective meeting, and this is what they discuss, and I'll go into each one a little bit of detail here. First, what went well in the sprint? The possible questions that can be asked to understand the reason behind the success in the iteration is by asking everybody what went well to accomplish all of the good things that happened. What motivated them to do what they did? What did they do differently to make it successful? Which training, skills, or knowledge contributed to the difference? What strong points made it happen? What strong points in the team made it happen? What is the team member's contribution that helped them accomplish this? And how did we achieve it? Number 2, what went wrong in the sprint? Well, while questions in this section should not be asked to assess the performance of an individual or to penalize, but to gather information and to identify the ways to resolve it in an upcoming sprint, where better to look to make improvements than where things were not going well. So the question unearths difficulties and issues and dissatisfactions that the team were currently facing. So how did it go wrong? What did you do that went wrong? How many were responsible for this to go wrong? Were you aware of what you were doing that it will go wrong? Did you understand that it was wrong and hence implemented something wrong? Did you understand right but it still went wrong? Or what did you do well? Number 3, what we had learned in the sprint. So what is the learning of the sprint? Well, these questions are helpful to identify what went right and what went wrong. It encourages the team to look at what they've learned about the way they were working. So some examples of these questions would be, how was the sprint executed? Where did it go wrong in the sprint? When did it go wrong? How did it go wrong? What techniques were useful? What techniques were not useful? What went in a smooth fashion during the sprint and what did not go smooth during the sprint? And what learning did the sprint educate them for the upcoming sprint? And number 4, what should we do differently in the next sprint? Well, this section basically focuses on identifying the possible corrective actions from the past successes, failures, and learning. So it would be asking questions like, how can the strength of the individual be utilized to resolve the issue? What should be done often to prevent the issue from arising again? Which actions must be implemented immediately for which you have the bandwidth and capability? Identify at least one thing to be changed and explain how you would change it, and what strategies will work to complete the job. So now that we've gone through what went right and what went wrong, we look at the corrective actions. So we would ask questions like, what will you do in the upcoming sprint to complete the action? How will you do it to make it a success? When will you do it during the sprint? Do you require help to complete this? What additional support do you require? How will you let me know that you completed it? And what will you do next after accomplishing this during the sprint? So there's 5 steps of conducting a successful sprint retrospective meeting. Usually retrospectives are a little more sophisticated than this, but let's follow these 5 steps. First, you got to set the stage. This is setting a goal, give the people the time to arrive and get into the right mood. Second, gather the data, help everyone remember and create a shared pool of information because everybody sees the world differently. 3, generate insight. Why did things happen the way they did? Identify patterns and see the big picture. 4, decide what to do. Pick a few issues to work on and create concrete action plans on what and how you'll address them. And 5, close the retrospective by clarifying follow-up, appreciations, a clear end, and how the retrospective could be improved. So things that you can run into in a sprint retrospective and how to handle them. So with the honest discussions happening during the sprint retrospective, there are some things that you need to be aware of that you could run into in the meeting. First is apathy. If the same questions are asked sprint after sprint after sprint, team members can become less engaged in the answers and stop offering up constructive suggestions to improve the process. So you should combat apathetic participation by mixing it up. The outcomes of a good retrospective could be reached by adapting different exercises and questions. There's no real, one rule for everything. So when it comes to a retrospective, you should just iterate on the way that you run this. Emotions. At the end of the day, we are people, and people have emotions. We are all not perfect creatures, and retrospectives should invite constructive feedback on what could be better in the future sprints, but it should never support hostility, baseless negativity, and finger pointing. It is vital to be non-judgmental and unbiased facilitators during the retrospective meeting. People should feel safe to share their feedback in the meeting, and be sure to set expectations when you kick off the sprint retrospective. Mediate along the way that when it's necessary, and promote a positive conversation. A lack of conversation. So you might have a sprint retrospective where it feels like questions are met with blank stares. Instead of pulling teeth to get the conversation going, come up with more engagement opening up into the meeting, and treat it like it's a great opportunity to drive incremental change that it is. So aside from that, you can encourage your team to write their suggestions and thoughts down throughout the course of a sprint, and this will give them something to look at during the retrospective instead of feeling like they need to pull something out of thin air because they can't think of something. Alternatively, you can also consider keeping a log of the things yourself as a project manager, things heard throughout the week in other agile meetings and during stand-ups. Pushback from leadership. This is a fun one. Sometimes action items identified in the retrospective impact members outside of the production team. Whoever is owning that item should be working with leadership to develop a conversation around the suggestions and detailed ways to make the request of change. It is possible, however, that leadership will be resistant to the suggestion. If this is the case, keep at it. Find your champion within the organization who will go to bat for the production team and the improvements that stem beyond them. An agile company, and one that values positive change, should eventually be willing and open to implementing process improvements that benefit the team at large. So be sure to frame any recommendations in a way that doesn't single anyone out or cause undue stress. And earnest participation. This is what you want to strive for. Sprint retrospectives can be a ceremony that people look forward to because it should create a space to assess how process improvements have gone and allow for more suggestions to follow. So strive for participation by offering up gratitude when team members really dive into the conversation, and be thankful to those who use the time to make meaningful contributions, and be positive. So if you like this video on what is a sprint retrospective, go ahead and smash the like button. And if you want to listen to other project management videos that I have on different topics, especially in agile project management, go ahead and subscribe to my channel because I upload them weekly. Thank you.